Here, I have all the most popular MacBooks, the 13 and 15-inch M2 MacBook Air, and the new M3 and M3 Pro MacBook Pro. Now, you can get the better MacBook Pro chassis without paying for the Pro processor, and you can also get a big screen without paying for a MacBook Pro. So how do you even choose? I've used all of them for quite a while and put them through benchmarks and battery life tests. And I think the new MacBook Pros would really change most people's purchasing decisions. Even I was surprised by the findings. So here are all the pros and cons. For most people who don't need every last bit of performance, the MacBook Air is one of the best laptops. But this year, the base M3 MacBook Pro finally got upgraded to the new chassis. And now the 14-inch MacBook Pro is only $300 more than the 15-inch MacBook Air. For this money, you not only get way more battery life and performance, more on that later, but the Pro chassis itself has a lot of nice features. The biggest one for me is the display. On the Pro model, it's a 120Hz mini LED display, whereas on the MacBook Air, you just get the regular 60Hz LCD screen. Now, if you're just checking them out in the Apple Store, they might not look that different, but the mini LED display is a lot more capable. The most obvious difference is that the mini LED display is much better for HDR content. In general, HDR is more vibrant and closer to what it looks like in real life. And it looks absolutely incredible on this screen. The MacBook Air technically supports HDR playback as well, but it's significantly less poppy than on the Pro, like you can see here in these lights. And also, the black colors aren't as dark like down here. The mini LED can independently turn off parts of the display and produce true black. And this affects regular SDR content as well. Like for these top and bottom black bars, you can see some noticeable glow on the Air. The MacBook Pro can hit 1600 nits peak for HDR content, which is pretty rare. Now, there isn't that much HDR content out there right now, but this mini LED display can still be beneficial in many other ways. Just look at the MacBook Pro next to the MacBook Air outside. It's an absolute night and day difference in terms of visibility. However, to get the MacBook Pro to hit the maximum sustained brightness of 1000 nits as shown here, you'll need a third-party app like Lunar. It does drain more battery, but this is the first laptop that I can comfortably work outside or next to really big windows for prolonged periods without any eye strain. However, to be fair though, the MacBook Air is already brighter than most other laptops. It can reach 500 nits. And if you mostly work indoors, it's gonna be bright enough. And of course, the MacBook Pro's 120Hz display does make animations and scrolling feel more smooth. However, the difference between 60Hz is not as noticeable as on a phone. So I think the MacBook Air's display still feels very good and responsive. And in terms of the pixel density, they're about the same. The Pros are slightly higher at 254 pixels per inch as opposed to 224 on the MacBook Air, but honestly, you can't really see pixels on either one, and it's not that big of a difference. But even if you don't really care about the screen, the battery life on the MacBook Pros are just on another level. The 14-inch MacBook Pro has an around 70 watt-hour battery, which is 5% bigger than on the 15-inch Air and 33% bigger than on the 13-inch Air. After playing back 4K videos for 3 hours, both the 15 and 13-inch M2 MacBook Air drained 36% battery. But the M3 Pro MacBook Pro only used 32%, and the M3 MacBook Pro only drained 30%, which means you can expect the M3 MacBook Pro to last 20% longer than the Airs when doing simple tasks like video watching. But that's not nearly the whole story, because the new M3 series processor are built on the new 3nm process from TSMC, and they're quite a bit more efficient. So they perform a lot better when you turn on the low power mode, which is very significant because in day-to-day use, many simple tasks, such as opening up a web page, can cause the CPU to ramp up to full power for a very little amount of time. And this drains a lot of battery. That's why when you have a MacBook play videos continuously, it can last over 10 hours. But when you're actually using it in real life, you get nowhere near that number. Now, low power mode essentially limits the maximum amount of power that the processor can use, from around 35 watts down to around 15 watts, which can actually gain you a significant amount of battery in day-to-day use. But with the M2 MacBook Airs, when low power mode is on, I can sometimes feel that the computer is noticeably less responsive. However, on both the M3 and M3 Pros, because the architecture is more efficient, they feel much more snappy on low power mode. And the numbers do back it up as well. On Geekbench multi-thread, the M2 Air can only keep around 55% of its performance when in low power mode, but the M3 MacBook Pro keeps 70% of its performance, and the M3 Pro does even better at 78%. So in low power mode, the M3 is 50% faster than M2, and the M3 Pro has doubled the M2's CPU performance. And this just means that the M3 machines are dramatically more usable in low power mode. Especially when I'm traveling, I do use the MacBook Pro's low power mode a lot. and it feels like they have double the battery life of the MacBook Air in its default mode. Overall, the MacBook Pro's battery life are really impressive. Perhaps the only exception is when you're doing heavy tasks like video rendering or gaming. You really don't want to be on low power mode for those things, and after 1 hour of running a gaming benchmark, the M3 Pro drained a whopping 63% of its battery. The M3 drained a lot as well, 47%. So if you do those things on the go, you might want to consider a powerful portable battery bank, like this one from today's video sponsor, Charge. This is a Shark Geek 100. It's a power bank with a very unique transparent casing, and it can do 100-watt fast charging, so it can fast charge any MacBook or just about anything else. You can even charge the battery bank itself at 100 watt as well. And you can see exactly how fast you're charging on this little screen. It's even colored. You can charge it with USB-C or DC, and it has a DC to USB-C and a USB-A port for output. This battery bank has a really large capacity at 25,600 milliamp hours, which is enough to fully charge any of these MacBooks, and it's still airline safe. Check out the Shark Geek 100 at the link down below. In addition to the much better screen and battery life, the Pro models also have noticeably nicer speakers. Even on the 15-inch Air, which has plenty of space around the keyboard, they still tuck the speakers underneath the keyboard to fire into the hinge, and this definitely degrades the sound quality. Just take a listen comparing it to the top-firing speakers on the 14-inch MacBook Pro. Pro has more bass, and I find it's an overall less tinny sound. And this is despite the fact that the 15-inch MacBook Air has 6 speakers just like on the MacBook Pros. On the 13-inch MacBook Air, there's actually even less space because it has 2 less woofers. The Pro models also have a lot more ports than on the Air. The M3 Pro has 3 USB-C ports, and they're on both sides, which is super convenient. The M3 is actually missing one, and so it just has 2 USB-C ports on the same side, and I find this difference very odd. Both MacBook Pros now have an HDMI 2.1 port. But on the M3 MacBook Pro, it's only supported to drive one 4K monitor up to 120Hz. I feel like it should be more, but right now you have to upgrade to the M3 Pro if you want to drive 2 monitors. And of course, the trade-off is that the Pro models are thicker and heavier, but what you may not realize is that the weight difference can actually be very marginal. The 14-inch M3 MacBook Pro is only 0.1 pound heavier than the 15-inch MacBook Air, but the 13-inch Air is about 20% lighter. To me, in terms of productivity, the 14-inch display feels more like the 15-inch because I can comfortably have 2 windows side by side on it. The 13-inch screen feels a bit tight. I think 14-inch might be the sweet spot in terms of display size for a portable laptop. Okay, so overall, the Pro's chassis just feels a bit more rigid. Not that the Air is flimsy feeling, but if you push down on the middle of the keyboard, the Pro keyboard does flex a little bit less, and it feels a bit nicer to type on as well. It's also filled in with black, which I personally don't have a preference for. However, I do love the new black MacBook Pro color, although I would say it's more like a dark gray, and it's pretty good at resisting fingerprints. The weird thing though is that it's only available on the M3 Pro and Max models. But anyways, moving on to the most important thing, the performance. First of all, regardless of if you're gonna buy an Air or a Pro, you really should consider more than 8 gigs of RAM, because on Apple Silicon, the GPU shares memory with the rest of the system. And after living with my M2 MacBook Air with 8 gigs of RAM for over a year, I realized that I'm actually using Swap like 90% of the time, and I mostly just use it for web browsing, so nothing heavy. Swap usage happens when you're out of RAM and the information is being swapped onto the SSD. Now, given how fast SSDs are nowadays, it might not feel any slower initially, but it will eventually slow down pretty significantly. On this M3 MacBook Pro with 8 gigs of RAM, after opening up the 12 tab in Safari, it's already using some swap. The system itself uses a few gigs of RAM, and so with 8 gigs, you really don't have that much. Getting more RAM can be very expensive from Apple, but I think it's worth it. Not just for the multitasking and speed benefit, but it's a fact that SSDs are fundamentally not designed to handle the constant random read and writes that RAM are designed for. And so using a lot of swap would actually reduce the SSD's longevity. And since you can't even replace the SSD, once it's dead, the MacBook is basically dead too. Alright, and as for the processor, so the new M3 series and the MacBook Pros are built on the new 3nm architecture, unlike the M2, which is on 5nm. This typically means big gains in performance and efficiency, and it does deliver. The base M3 CPU is around 19% faster than the M2 for both single-core and multi-core, which is a pretty big improvement. The M3 Pro is actually slightly slower than the M3 in terms of single-core performance, but for multi-core, it's 20% faster than the M3 and 42% faster than the M2. But just how much impact does this actually have in real life? Well, in my daily use, it's honestly not much. Of course, for large single-threaded tasks, such as applying these Photoshop filters, the new processor does pull noticeably ahead, as you can see here. But the reality is that most tasks are just not intense enough to even show a difference. Even the heaviest websites, such as Google Earth, loads very fast on all of them. For the majority of things that I do, and probably for you as well, such as web browsing or maybe some light coding, it's really hard to tell a difference between M3 and M2. But of course, like I talked about earlier, the battery life benefit from putting M3 on low power mode is huge. However, when it comes to GPU intensive tasks such as production and gaming, the Airs really don't cut it. And the new MacBook Pros are really great at those things. Well, actually not really the M3 model, because it's only 9% faster in GPU performance when compared to the M2. But the M3 Pro is 40% faster than the M3 and 53% faster than the M2 when it comes to GPU. When matching the amount of RAM, the M3 Pro actually only costs $200 more than the M3, which is really great value if you need the GPU power. And this does translate to real life. For rendering a 15-minute 4K video, the M3 Pro finished 24% faster than the M2. Another benefit of the MacBook Pros is that they have a fan, so it does a thermal throttle and it could basically sustain full performance indefinitely. But for short bursts of work and other daily tasks, the fanless Air never runs into thermal problems, at least in my use case. Regardless of Air or Pro, they all get pretty hot, especially in the middle of the keyboard. And another thing to mention is that Apple Silicon MacBooks in general don't lose performance when on battery, which is really great, and it's kind of taken for granted, but it's actually not the case for many Windows laptops. Now, the new GPU in the M3 also supports ray tracing, which means that games could look a lot better on Macs. And the numbers do back it up. In the Solar Bay test, they scored much better than the M2, especially the M3 Pro. So maybe in a year's time, there will be many nice looking ray trace games available on Macs. For most people, the M2 chip is probably going to be more than fast enough. The M2 MacBook Airs are great machines, and you can say it has everything you need. But the MacBook Pros kind of just has so many nicer things that you would want, like the HDR 120Hz display, the much longer battery life, and the extra performance, which even if you don't really need, you can convert it to even more battery life with low power mode. Overall, the new M3 line of MacBook Pros are really nice, and finally they all have the same chassis. If you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe and like. You can check out my other socials, and you can also watch more here.